had spent years building a life that looked complete from the outside. A career I had worked hard for, friends who cared about me, a comfortable apartment filled with the things people tell you will make you happy. And in many ways, I was grateful. But gratitude and peace are not the same thing, and I knew, in the quietest part of myself, that despite everything I had accumulated, there was a hollow space inside me that nothing I had tried could fill. It is a strange kind of suffering, that emptiness, because it does not announce itself with drama. It does not arrive in a single catastrophic moment. Instead, it hums, quietly, persistently, beneath every ordinary day, a low frequency of incompleteness that you learn to function around because you do not know what else to do. I remember standing in my kitchen one morning, coffee in hand, sunlight coming through the window in that particular way that looks almost like a postcard of a happy life, and thinking, why does none of this feel like enough? That question was the beginning of everything. I started searching. Not for Islam specifically, I want to be honest about that. I was searching for something real, something beyond the surface of things. I read philosophy. I revisited the faith I had grown up with, turning it over in my hands like an object I no longer recognized. I meditated. I journaled. I spoke to people who seemed to carry a certain kind of quietness in them, a settled, unshakable quality that I desperately wanted and could not explain. And then I came across a woman online speaking about her conversion to Islam. She was not dramatic. She was not shouting or making grand claims. She simply sat in front of a camera and spoke with the steady, luminous certainty of someone who has found what they were looking for. I watched for a few minutes. Then I watched again from the beginning. And by the end, something in me, something I had no name for, had shifted almost imperceptibly, like a door opening just a crack to let in a thin line of light. What followed were months of quiet, private research. I did not tell anyone. I was not ready for that. I simply sat alone each night, reading, listening, questioning. And during those months, 3 things happened that I could not argue my way out of. 3 things that broke through every wall I had built and left me standing, finally in the open. The first was the Quran. I had approached it with academic detachment, the way you might approach any ancient religious text, respectfully, but from a comfortable distance. I told myself I was simply being thorough. I told myself I would read a few chapters, satisfy my curiosity and move on. But something happened when I began to read that I was not prepared for. It was not the content alone, though the content was extraordinary. It was the way the words landed. Even in translation, there was a quality to the Quran that I had never encountered in any other writing, not in literature, not in philosophy, not in any sacred text I had read before. It felt alive. It felt addressed. Not to humanity in the abstract, but to me, specifically, in the particular condition I was in at that particular moment of my life. I remember reaching the verse that describes God as closer to a person than their jugular vein. I sat very still when I read that. I read it again, and then a third time, because what it described was not a distant, unknowable deity requiring intermediaries and rituals and theological systems to approach. It described a presence, intimate, immediate, constant, a presence that had been with me in every moment I had felt invisible, in every sleepless night when I had whispered into the dark without knowing who I was speaking to. The realization that dawned on me next was almost unbearable in its simplicity. I had been reaching for this my entire life. I had been reaching for exactly this, and I had simply been reaching in the wrong direction. I set the book down and pressed my hands flat on the table in front of me, as if I needed something solid to hold on to. The room was quiet. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of the street. And inside me, something that had been wound tightly for years was slowly, carefully beginning to release.
How could a book written 14 centuries ago speak so precisely to what I was experiencing right now? How could words preserved across that vast span of time carry this kind of immediate, personal weight? I had no answer that satisfied my skepticism, and slowly I began to understand that my skepticism was not the problem. My skepticism was simply lagging behind what my heart already knew. The second thing was the concept of Tawheed, the absolute, undivided oneness of God. I had grown up with a version of God that required paradox to understand, a God who was three and yet one, a God whose love for humanity required a sacrifice of flesh and blood before it could reach us. I had accepted these ideas for years because I was told that mystery was part of faith, that the things which did not make sense were precisely the things most worth believing in. But in my private moments of prayer, the real ones, the ones at 3 a.m. when I was too tired and too honest to perform anything, I had always spoken to one, a singular presence, undivided and complete, not a committee, not a mystery requiring theological expertise to navigate. One, simply, entirely one. When I encountered Tawheed, I did not feel like I was learning something new. I felt like I was finally hearing the name of something I had always known. And here is what I need you to understand about that moment. It was not an intellectual victory. It was not the satisfaction of having won an argument with myself. It was something far more personal and far more profound. It was the recognition that the deepest, most private instinct I had ever carried about the nature of the divine, the instinct I had been quietly ashamed of because it did not match the theology I had been given, was not a failing. It was correct. It had always been correct. Islam did not ask me to accept paradox in exchange for belonging. Islam gave me the clarity I had been starving for, the absolute, the eternal, the one, complete, without division, without contradiction, without limit. A God worthy of the word God. I remember walking out of the library where I had been sitting with these ideas for hours, stepping into the cold evening air, and feeling something I can only describe as structural relief, as if a building inside me that had been constructed on a crooked foundation had finally been set straight. The third thing was a group of people I began to study. I want to be precise here, because this is the thing that perhaps surprised me most. I had expected, if I am honest, to find flaws when I looked closely at the community of believers. I had absorbed, without always realizing it, a great deal of cultural noise about what Muslims were, images deposited by headlines and offhand comments, and years of background cultural static. I expected to find rigidity, judgment, a faith that demanded you make yourself smaller to fit inside it. Instead, I found the companions. I had begun reading about the early Muslims, the people who had known the Prophet, peace be upon him, personally, who had heard his voice and sat in his presence and carried his teachings forward into a world that was often hostile to what they believed. I had expected to find in them what I found in the zealots of any historical movement. People electrified by ideology, hardened by certainty, willing to do anything in the name of belief. What I found was something entirely different. I found people who wept when they heard the Quran recited, people who gave away their last loaves of bread to neighbors who were hungrier, people who, when asked to describe their faith, did not reach for abstract theology. They described a relationship, a living, breathing, daily relationship with a God who was present in every detail of their lives, from the way they greeted each other in the morning, to the way they face difficulty without despair. I read about a man who, upon embracing Islam, felt as though the entire world had changed around him. Not because anything visible had shifted, but because he was seeing it differently, through new eyes that understood that nothing in this world was without meaning, without design, without the fingerprint of a creator who had fashioned it all with care and intention. I sat with that image for a long time, because I had felt something like that, briefly, unexpectedly, in the weeks since I had begun this journey. Moments of ordinary life that suddenly seemed lit from within. The sound of rain on a window, the smell of bread baking, the precise, particular blue of a winter sky. Things that had always been there, suddenly visible in a way they had not been before. The people I was studying had not been special in the way we usually mean that word. They were merchants and farmers and mothers and scholars and freed slaves. They were ordinary people who had encountered an extraordinary truth and had been transformed by it. And the transformation was not a performance. It was not a costume they wore on holy days. It was a restructuring of the self at the most fundamental level. A reorientation of the entire human being towards something real and permanent and worthy. I kept returning to one question as I read. What would it mean to live like that? Not to perform faith, not to inherit it or inherit its aesthetics, but to actually live from the inside of it, to wake each morning knowing exactly who you are, who made you, and why you are here. The answer to that question took me a long time to fully accept. Not because I doubted it, but because accepting it meant changing everything. And change, even when it is towards something better, requires a kind of courage that does not come all at once. It comes in pieces, in small, private moments of choosing truth over comfort, in the quiet of a room late at night, when you finally stop arguing with yourself and simply allow what you already know to be true. That is where I found myself, eventually. Not at the dramatic end of a crisis, but at the quiet beginning of something I have no better word for than home.